There's no mistaking that the thing that draws me into the forests of this magnificent country is the feeling of mystery it evokes. To be enveloped in a world where everything understands its role and you are nothing more than a witness to the seamless perfection of purposeful relationships that occur within that space. The sights, smells and sounds invite you into a world that requires nothing from you. You are a welcome guest, a bystander, in a magical world where secrets are shared with anyone willing to listen. In the depths of these ancient landscapes, the lyrebird and the forest share a dance of shadows and sounds. The lyrebird cloaks itself in the song of its surroundings, becoming a part of the mystery within the environment. To encounter a lyrebird is like entering a world where reality and illusion blur. It's in the timeless dance that the lyrebird and the forest are intertwined, each reflecting the other's beauty, presenting to us the astonishing adaptability and intelligence of nature. The team at If These Trees Could Talk wish to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Wanneroo Nation. We would like to recognise that we share our stories from the stolen lands of our nation's first storytellers. Our conversations in many ways follow their traditions of storytelling and sharing knowledge and experience. We wish to pay our respect to the Wanneroo elders and ancestors, as well as extend that respect to all First Nations people, including our listeners, and acknowledge and honour their continued connections to the land and waters that have been the inspiration for the stories that we share.
Today's episode covers stories and facts about the native lyrebird that lives on traditional Aboriginal land over parts of Australia. Shannon shares her experiences from the Barrington Tops, which lies at the boundary of three Aboriginal territories, the lands of the Worimi people to the southeast, the Biripi people to the east, and the Wanneroo people to the west. And our guest speaker and subject matter expert Alex is joining us virtually from Wurundjeri country.
Straight away, I noticed the diggings underneath the trees. It was a bit surreal, actually.
We found that up to 50% of all the rainforests that lyrebirds inhabit were burnt to some extent. This is a terrible thing. In one very short lifetime, the rainforest in particular has been transformed.
In today's episode, we are heading to the Barrington Tops National Park in New South Wales with a couple of extra little stops along the way. Today, we are also bringing a guest. A few weeks ago, we spent a wonderful few days in the Gloucester and Barrington Tops. Barrington Tops National Park, which covers both of these areas, is 370 kilometres north of Sydney and is bordered on the east by Gloucester and on the west by Scone. They are the two hubs from which most visitors enter the park. The ecology of the national park varies from temperate rainforest in the gullies to alpine regions on the mountain's peaks. Snow usually falls on the mountain peaks a few days during winter each year. The park is part of the World Heritage Site Gondwana Rainforests of Australia and was added to the National Heritage List in 2007. I live at the base of the Wadigan Mountains, which is about 2.5 hours from the Barringtons, and we spend a lot of time traipsing around the forest close to home. It's not at all unusual in winter to hear lyrebirds' calls while we are exploring or to see one dart across the track as we're travelling along. As an amateur photographer, I've so badly wanted to catch an image of one of these incredible birds whose elusive calls let you know that they are there, but you hear them far more than you see them. About 2 years ago, when I was setting my goals for the year, photographing a lyrebird was, I think, about number 3 on the list of things that I wanted to achieve. I ticked everything else off, but that list has remained stuck on the front of my fridge, taunting me ever since. This trip to the Barringtons was a bit spontaneous. We had planned a camping trip with my beautiful friend Kelly and her kiddos earlier that week, but it didn't go to plan due to wet weather. So the night before we left, we booked a gorgeous Airbnb at Rawdon Vale, right on the Kerripit River. And we thought if all else fails, we'll have a lovely time playing board games and drinking wine by the fire. But the weather got on board and we had 3 perfect days exploring Gloucester and the Barrington Tops National Park. On the first morning, we got up early and headed to Gloucester Tops. We took breakfast and Scotty, as he does, got busy cooking it on the fire as we all explored the area and along the river. This little picnic area was on a gorgeous moss plain in the gully, and straight away I noticed the diggings underneath the trees. It was a bit surreal actually, with the twisted moss-covered trees and the blanket of moss on the ground, and it started to mist as the sun hit it for the first time that day. Little wrens were hopping all around us and a super friendly currawong was intent on stealing our avocado. He didn't succeed. The kids were racing off around the trails and grabbed the camera and screaming through the forest. And while I knew that this was the perfect lyrebird habitat, I thought there was no way we would see one with our excited little explorers doing their thing. But just after breakfast, I managed to steal back the camera from Charlie and took a little stroll. And just as I started, I caught a glimpse of that tail duck into the ferns next to the road. The little guy was pretty hungry and he seems to be quite happy just digging and foraging while I watched from a distance. I was absolutely elated. I followed him along the bank of the river for about half an hour, both of us just doing our thing. By this time, Charlie had cottoned on to what was happening and he crept over to me slowly and quietly. Charlie's been a witness to me jumping out of non-stationary vehicles and taking off up trails for 2 years, and I could see the elation on his face that I was having this experience. It was really special sharing it with him and will probably go down as one of the lasting memories of his childhood. It was a really, really lovely experience. The following day, we headed to the Barringtons, and at every stop we could hear the mimics of the male birds. Very different to the day before. There weren't a lot of calls. We pulled up at the firs, which is a patch of Douglas firs that were planted years ago in amongst the eucalypt forest. It's a bit of a spooky place, with the trees blocking out almost all of the light. You almost feel like you're entering Canada as you drive into them. Again, we heard them straight away. The first call was further away, and he was exceptional at his kookaburra mimic. It took me a few minutes to actually realise that it wasn't a kookaburra. I took a little walk out into the ferns on the far side of the firs, and on my way back I watched Charlie stalking through the fallen logs with the camera in hand, and he looked up at me with his eyes like saucers and did the shh symbol. He spent ages laying on a big log capturing shots of a male and female lyrebird digging and feeding. His excitement was contagious. All 3 of the kids were super invested in observing them, and it was really lovely to witness. We spent ages there listening to calls and identifying and recording them. Charlie, who is 10, has now requested his own camera, as sharing mine is no longer an option as he embarks on this month's career choice of being a wildlife photographer. I haven't seen him as invested since he accosted the captain of a whale watching cruise in Bermagui and in-depthly questioned him on the education choices he needed to make to secure a role on a whale watching boat. The guy liked him so much that he said he would take him out again the next day. We headed home that afternoon and, like always, I was intent on finding out as much as humanly possible about lyrebirds. And that's where I discovered another national treasure.
Before you jump into this next section, Shannon, I think it is time for one of our section break sound effects. And I have grabbed one of your audio files from this trip that you're speaking about to use for this week's episode.
For today's episode, we are joined by Dr Alex Maisey. Alex is a postdoctoral researcher with the Department of Environment and Genetics at La Trobe University. Alex's PhD research explored the role of superb lyrebirds as ecosystem engineers within the forests of the Victorian Central Highlands. He has worked in conjunction with BirdLife Australia and the World Wildlife Fund on research that has studied the impact of Australia's black summer bushfires. Alex is also an associate member of the Sherbrooke Forest Lyrebird Study Group, and he has joined us today to introduce us all to the fascinating world of the superb lyrebird. Dr Alex Maisey, welcome to If These Trees Could Talk.
Thank you very much, Shannon.
Alex is joining us remotely today from his home, and we might start back at the beginning because I know that your passion for lyrebirds began at a very early age. Can you tell us a bit about how these childhood experiences cemented what came next for you?
Yeah, definitely. So it did start early for me. I was thinking about it earlier today, actually, and thought that remembering the first time I actually saw a lyrebird, and I must have been really young. I reckon maybe 6 or 7 years old. And my parents had moved to Callista next to the Sherbrooke Forest. So that's a really well-renowned place to see lyrebirds. And I recall one day going for a walk with my parents and some friends of theirs. And we went down this little forest track past this clearing. And I recall them pointing out this lyrebird. And all I can sort of remember seeing is this tail just disappearing through the bracken ferns. And I must have been pretty short because I can remember it being difficult to see over the ferns at this bird, but it was just a glimpse of a male lyrebird. And I can remember the big lyrate feathers and the filamentary feathers. And that was sort of my first experience, just this glimpse of this forest and of this lyrebird in the forest. And it really sparked an interest in me. And at the time, I didn't know anything about what sort of animals were there or what sort of birds they were. I knew that was a lyrebird, but I always had this sort of dream of seeing these exotic animals appear in this forest. And I had books that I guess were from all around the world and birds from the Amazon. So, I had this dream that I might see like a scarlet macaw or something fly through the forest. But, this unknown mystery that fascinated me. So it sort of hooked me very young. And then as I got older, I can recall years later, we discovered in June and July in the breeding season this particular lyrebird down on Paddy Track. And we'd walk down this track, and in June and July, you'd hear these calls. And I can just remember the excitement of going down this path, and then you'd hear the call, the whistle song or the territorial song, and you'd think, he's there. We're going to see him. And he was such a lovely bird, and we got to know this bird, and we named him Mr. Show-Off because every time we'd get in there, he'd be showing off all his songs and doing the kookaburra and the magpie. And I don't recall ever seeing him display or dance in those early years, but it was just to hear that song. And then outside of the breeding season, you'd go down there and he wouldn't be calling anymore. And it was sort of like, oh, that's really sad. There goes the winter. And so it was something really special about winter time. And then the funny thing was, years later, I sort of discovered who this bird was, and he was well known to the Lyrebird group as Mr. Graham. And this bird just went on. I had this really long sort of relationship with this lyrebird, and so many people did. It was a very special lyrebird, and many people came and filmed and photographed this particular bird. But it was just an amazing way to get hooked on that species.
Then leading into your school life, you made the choice then that you obviously wanted to really study these birds. Can you tell us a little bit about how you convinced your parents to allow you to take the path that you did, and what your day-to-day kind of looked like in that space?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I did get a little bit carried away with the birds when I was young. I always had pet birds and chickens and, budgerigars and things. And I really didn't like school in primary school. I always got out in the wetlands. Well, I was very fortunate in my primary school to have a big wetland area. And one particular teacher, Michelle Rayner, and she was she was really fantastic at encouraging the kids to get out into this wetland. It used to be just a fenced dam with reeds and full of footballs and basketballs, but she got in there and started weeding it with us. So I remember pulling ivy off the trees and learning about the native plants. And we'd go and we'd look for frogs and we'd look for yabbies and do ponding and all sorts of things in that dam. And that was, I guess, a really important experience early on that got me hooked on nature. And I really didn't like the idea of going to high school. And I can always recall my grandmother picking me up on a Wednesday or a Thursday after school, and she'd say, "How was your day, Alex?" And I'd say to her, "Oh, look, Nana, it was another wasted day, you know." I wanted to be out in the forest or playing with my chickens, not sitting in a classroom. So when it came towards year 7 and this big scary idea of high school, I started working on my parents saying, "Yeah, you know, can I went and had a look at a few different schools and just didn't like them." I'd actually, you know, as a little guy, I'd go into these schools and I'd burst into tears. Like, Mum would take me to see the school and I just was like, "No, I don't want to do this." And, you know, she was great to entertain the idea of looking into this homeschooling program, which we did. And it was fantastic. So I started off in year 7, attending 2 days a week. So it was basically like it was the same curriculum as Yea High School, exactly, with some of the same teachers as. So that's a little country high school here in Victoria that ran the program. And we'd do all our lessons, learn everything we needed to learn from our teachers, and go home and do the homework. And you really had to be very self-motivated. Otherwise, they really wouldn't let you continue. So there was this expectation. You were treated a lot like adults. So there was a lot of sort of mutual respect there from the teachers, but it was understood that you had to do your work and cooperate to be able to continue on. So, and there was this big motivation that, you know, if it didn't work out, then I'd have to go to normal school. So that was what that's what it entailed. And to be honest, it was fantastic. I'd meet up with Jan Incoll, the Lyrebird lady in the Sherbrooke Lyrebird survey group from about age sort of 12, I guess. The last year or so of primary school, it was on my weekends. And then when I started the homeschool program, I was able to head into the forest 4 or 5 days, mornings a week, and I'd go for my walk and look for the lyrebirds. We'd find the nests, learn about the species, and then I'd come home and work the afternoon, the rest of the morning and the afternoon, doing my homework. So it worked out really well for me.
Side quest. I know that we're here to talk about Lyrebirds, but I'm fascinated in this part of the story as somebody with a teaching background. Firstly, how can teachers do a better job? Because I can imagine you are a minority in terms of somebody who's gone, "No, this is not for me," and being able to, perhaps in a non-linear way, find your way to where you are right now. But how can, you know, I'm imagining that doesn't happen for many people who decide, "No, I'm not going to go to school. That's not for me." What can teachers do differently?
That's a tricky one, and I don't know that I've got a very good answer. I think if you have the capacity with, I guess, smaller class sizes where you can be a little more bespoke in your education that's offered, that really allowed me to be able to delve really deeply into my interests. I did find it interesting. I mean, being homeschooled, I think the social side of it was interesting too, because I did acrobatics and I did fire twirling and circus, and I would go and meet up with, you know, kids my own age once or twice a week to do the circus training, and that was an important part of keeping socially connected with peers. So that was one aspect that was important. But in terms of how teachers could foster that, I think it's tough. I think it's really hard when you've got large classes with lots of kids. You've got some kids that are, you know, really quiet and really studious, and other kids that are running riot and active, and, you know, they might not really fit in with the mold, and to accommodate everyone, I think is really challenging. But, you know, wherever possible, to try and find those interests and encourage them and allow them to to grow. I think that's probably key, but easier said than done, I think.
Before we go back to the Lyrebird topic, I just want to acknowledge that your parents and you made a very brave decision, and it's obviously paid off. So well done, Maisey family.
Yeah, thank you. It did work out, and I don't think it would work out for everyone. I think it took a fair degree of trust between both my parents and myself, and the teachers and myself. It has been really fabulous, and this year I caught up with my year 7 and 8, or 8 and 9 maybe, science teacher, and she sort of did the biology and maths and all sorts of things really, but they did what they needed to do. But she came to a Lyrebird survey this year, and it was just fabulous to catch up with her and have that ongoing connection too. So they did a great job, and I hope that other people get that sort of opportunity where they can.
So now we've covered that stuff and satisfied our own curiosity, we might go back to the topic at hand, which is, of course, lyrebirds. Can you give us a bit of just an overview for myself, obviously, and people listening about these incredible birds?
Certainly. So the lyrebird is a really well-renowned species across the world, and a lot of this is thanks to David Attenborough, and Sir David included the lyrebird in his Life of Birds series. And this was where the popularity of the lyrebird really took off, largely because they showed a bird that was reproducing all these incredible sounds, a lot of which were human origin.
Yes, I know
And
the
there's
exact
quite
footage you're talking about.
Yeah, it was, I think, voted by a whole lot of people to be his most favoured moment in all time. So a really hugely popular little clip, and it fit in with a really important narrative about the clearing of the forests in southeastern Australia, that this lyrebird was mimicking its demise in the chainsaws and the machinery that they were hearing in their natural environment. But what actually happened was there's actually an interesting and quite funny backstory to it. That particular bird was a captive born lyrebird that never heard wild lyrebirds singing to it. And lyrebirds, fascinatingly, learn culturally. So there's cultural transmission from older lyrebirds to younger birds about which sounds to mimic. So in the wild, it's actually very rare to hear a truly human origin sound.
Mm-hmm.
They do it, but most of the sounds that people hear and say, oh, this lyrebird was mimicking lasers or a ram pump or some other sort of mechanical sound, it's often their dance song. So it's their own call that they've evolved to do over millennia. And it just sounds very otherworldly. So people believe it to be human origin, but it's generally not. So this bird in Hillsville Sanctuary was doing all of the drills and the chainsaws from the sanctuary workers, but actually wasn't a wild bird. So that's when the popularity of the lyrebird really shot off around the world. But before that, lyrebirds were always very, I guess, sought after for, interestingly enough, in European times, their feathers for ladies' hats in London. Of all things. And in the 1930s, they actually were really worried, early conservationists were very worried about the lyrebird populations being depleted because so many were being shot for their tails. As a response to this, they actually took 13 pairs of lyrebirds down to Tasmania. Now, lyrebirds don't actually pair up, but they took 13 pairs down, and they let them go to try and make sure that they didn't go extinct on the mainland. And now, today, the lyrebirds in Tasmania are actually doing really, really well. But it is an introduced population, and we think they were probably never there. So currently, the lyrebird's range goes from about, the natural range is from Fish Creek in Victoria up to a place called Girraween National Park in just where sort of Queensland's border dips into New South Wales and the Granite Belt up there. They're in the wetter forest, so they like particularly sort of wet ferny forests like up on Barrington or here in Sherbrooke Forest. But in Girrawheen, they're in a comparatively dry habitat, and they forage for invertebrates in the soil. So they dig for worms and amphipods, the little crustaceans that hop in the soil, and they have these beautiful tails as well. So the tails are used for display. The males have these lovely lyrate tails. So they're called a lyrebird, not because they fib, but actually because of the shape of the tail, and it's like the lyre, the musical instrument, with these beautiful curly feathers. And so they have the beautiful dance, they have the mimicry, they can mimic all sorts of birds and animals in their forest environment. So they really capture people's imagination. They're about the size of a tall chicken, but with a really long, impressive tail. And they're what's called sexually dimorphic. So the boys look really quite different to the girls, and that's a result of millions of years of evolution, where the female lyrebirds are choosing which males they want to mate with, and that's based on this elaborate tails as well as the song. So the most basic evolutionary principle is if you're able to survive with this crazy large ornate tail and still get away from the foxes and still feed yourself, even though you're putting all this energy into growing this absurdly large tail, you must be a pretty fit male to mate with. So that's what's probably driven that sort of sexual dimorphism. So that's a bit of an overview of what the lyrebird is, but they're actually a songbird. That's why they're so good at singing.
So when we were in the Barringtons, we actually got to see a lyrebird doing its mimicking cry. So we were able to spot the bird while he was doing it. He was up on top of a couple of logs that were piled on top of each other, and he was flipping the tail over, and
Oh, wow.
but he was not on his mount.
Yeah.
And as we obviously scared him, we did try and keep a safe distance, but he headed off into the ferns where I'm assuming his mound was. And Charlie and I were recording some of the calls just so we could go back and try and identify what birds were what and what he was mimicking. We probably sat there for a good half an hour, and the call changed, and we thought it was a human origin sound, it sounded like a sport shutter on a camera.
Yep.
So that click, 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 pause, click, 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 pause. I've realised that that's not what it was. But can you tell us a little bit just about those, the natural calls, the ones that they're not mimicking?
Sure. So I've done a fair bit of work over the years with a colleague up at Western Sydney Uni, Anastasia Diel, and she did her PhD back in 2007 to 9 in Sherbrooke on the song of lyrebirds, and discovered that their song is, particularly their dance song, is very predictable. So they have specific dance calls, and they're generally broken into there's sort of four main ones. One of them is a really loud plick. In Sherbrooke, it's a double plick, but it varies a little bit. So here they say blue blue, and they dance rhythmically in between those plicks. They do these tuggerers, they used to call them, or Len Smith here in Sherbrooke would call them tuggerers. And when he does this tuggerer in between, he dances from one foot to the other and flaps his wings down. And he has to coordinate very carefully the dance move with the songs, because as Anna showed in her study, they can do one without the other. So they don't have to do the dance move to produce the sound and vice versa. And it's actually thought that it's cognitively challenging for a lyrebird to match those. So just like a human has to learn to dance, the lyrebird does too. And of course, they're learning culturally from other lyrebirds to work out what they need to do. And this varies across the range. So if you're a lyrebird up in New South Wales, your dance is likely to be a little bit different and your song a little bit different to the ones down here. But then they do this other sound, which is the one that is almost always mistaken for a human origin sound, where their tail is totally inverted across their head, so put right over their body, and they just transform themselves from this brown bird that's quite well camouflaged into this silver and chestnut bird that it doesn't even look like a bird when the tail's fully inverted. It's a really impressive display. And they open their tail wide and they go twang, 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 twang. And if the female comes onto the mound, that's when she circles the tail. And you can really see in the videos that, if you set up spy cameras on mounds, she circles the mound and the tail and on the mound, looking at the lyrates and obviously listening to the song and checking out these dance moves. And it's like he does the grapevine step, so he crosses his feet, and it's a very specific behaviour that goes with that dance. And most of the time that I've seen this behaviour, almost all the time, she just leaves, and she leaves without mating, and he looks so disappointed. But she's so fussy about which male she's going to mate with that she generally will go from male to male along a slope and check out all of the tails of all of the birds and decide which one's the best one.
I think I can relate to this. I'm pretty sure that's how I chose my husband, on how well he could dance.
On the dance floor.
Yeah, that's where we met.
So how close are their territories, Alex? Because when we were in the furs area, we heard when we first arrived a call from a male that seemed to be a bit further away, and he was exceptionally good at the kookaburra noise. The one that we observed later and were able to see him doing the cries and went off into the fern forest, his kookaburras were really short and truncated. So how close are their territories for the males?
They can be fairly close. So they're described as a dispersed lek, where the males come into an area and they all call from generally an acoustically prominent spot. So they don't want to be right in the valley where their song isn't going to, carry to a lot of females. So they'll want to be up a little bit on a saddle or where there's a confluence of creek lines, because the females really like to nest in the creeks. But they'll be quite close together. They won't generally be randomly sort of distributed. And what I often see is when a female does come onto a mound and then leave, the male seems to just give up really quickly, and he'll bring his tail in together, like the lyrates in together, and he'll say crick, 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 crick. And then he just races off, and the female's still there. And you think, but mate, the female's still there.
She might change her mind.
Don't give up. But then you realise he's got a plan, and he just disappears. And then he starts calling at the other end of his territory. And I'm convinced he's trying to trick the female into thinking that he is the neighbour and that she might just come in and have another look, and she might change her mind that time. So it's really bizarre behaviour, but very funny to watch because it's just so predictable every time. You think, oh, you've given up so easily.
So I know that the males are widely regarded for their mimicking, but I did hear recently, I think it was on a podcast with a lady called Vicky, and she's done some research into female birds, and she was talking about some of the ways that the female birds have learned to mimic certain sounds to help protect their nests.
That's right. So, yeah, Vicky's a good friend of mine, and she also came to visit Sherbrooke during her PhD, which was very lovely. A lot of people don't realise the females can and do mimic every bit as well as the males, but they do it in very, very different contexts. So when I've been checking nests and to see how old the chick is, they only have the one chick, so it's a big job for a female lyrebird. And she invests so much in this nest, so much in the egg, 6 weeks of incubation and then another 6 weeks that the chick's on the nest. So she's really defensive over this baby. and she will come up often really close. Some of these lyrebirds, if they're a little bit more used to people, they'll even jump on your head. I've had one bird that would actually attack me. She'd jump onto my arm. I'd have my arm above my head, and she'd be raking her talons into my hair, and really amazing mothers. But she'd produce all of these incredible sounds, typically things like goshawks or wedge-tailed eagles. I had one bird, one female lyrebird, that came up and just perfectly mimicked a cat. And it just sounded like a domestic cat. It was just amazing. So these calls are not just random. They're a different suite of calls of mimicry to that of the males, and they're generally often predators or alarm calls. And if you were a small nest predator like a butcher bird or even a grey shrike thrush, which you wouldn't think to be a nest predator, but I have had a video of one eating an egg. If you were one of those birds that came to a nest and heard an eagle or a cat or something or a fox, you'd very quickly think twice about sticking your head into a dark nest where you can't see what's coming but from behind you. So it's a really good defense strategy. Yeah.
So mentioning the cats there, I know that in the Wadigans, near where I live, that feral cats, deer and foxes are a big problem within the national park there. And in the Barringtons, there's things like brumbies and pigs. We did see a cat run across the road while we were there as well. What kind of impact do these invasive species have on the lyrebirds? Well, I suppose population and its habitat.
Huge impact. The experience we've had here in Sherbrooke has been, I guess, more around in the early days, cats and foxes. Feral cats and domestic cats even were thought to be taking a lot of the chicks in the nests back in the late 1980s. And for the first time anywhere in Australia, the Sherbrooke Shire introduced a cat curfew. And it was an Australia first, apparently. And that required people to keep their cats indoors at night, which may not have helped lyrebirds that much, because at night lyrebirds are roosting way up the tops of trees. But it did raise the profile of conservation considerably. And after that, Parks Victoria started to control foxes. And another early memory that I have was my dad sitting down reading the paper one day, and there was an article by the Bradleys, Harold and Isabel Bradley, who were early Sherbrooke lyrebird people. And they were really concerned because they'd done their dawn count and found that the population was just declining year after year, and they were getting to sort of pretty critically low numbers. They thought there might have been only 50 birds left in the forest. And they were really asking Parks Victoria to step up their fox control program. And that happened. That did happen after that. And to give you an idea of the change in the population, when I was 11 and started in Sherbrooke, we counted about 25 male lyrebirds on the annual count. And last year we had about 60. So
wow,
that population has grown massively. In that time, it's been a sort of pretty steady increase. And I think now we're at the stage where we're probably close to the capacity of the forest. So it's been a real success story. And I'd put it down, mostly to fox control.
Yep.
But now we've got new issues, and the main new problem we have are feral deer, sambar deer, a huge invasive pest that was released in the 1800s by acclimatization societies to make it feel more like home.
Yep.
And these animals have just spread right across the country. Really, they're coming up through to the north, and I mean the sambar are a tropical species, so I can't imagine there'd be anything to stop them continuing up to the wet tropics. So a huge issue, and it's a massive animal, a massive herbivore. And the problem with them is they're hard hooved, so they destroy the ground layer. they're very hungry. They're, a 300 kilogram herbivore, so they eat a lot of the overbrowse, the ground ferns, and then they wallow in the creeks. So, as an 11-year-old here, I would drink the water happily out of the headwaters of Monbulk Creek. And I remember my old neighbour saying, "Oh, it's the best water, the best spring water in Victoria. I had it tested," he'd tell me. And now you look at it and it's tragic. The creek literally runs turbid. There's so much suspended muck and mud in the water that because of all these deer wallows and these runs, and they weren't there back, 25 years ago. They just weren't. There was beautiful moss beds and they're all gone.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, these sambar deer with their big antlers, they have these huge antlers. They like to rub on our rainforest tree trunks. They rub their antlers and they scent mark. So they'll actually ring bark trees by just rubbing the bark off them. And so in Monbulk Creek, the little creek behind where I live here, the sassafras trees are dying. Maybe 90% of them are on their way out. And you just think this is a terrible thing. In one very short lifetime, the rainforest in particular has been transformed. So it's an absolute disaster. So pigs are the same. Pigs rooting through the erosion they cause. Again, they're really, really destructive, particularly in rainforests. So, temperate rainforests are a really special vegetation type where lyrebirds and a lot of things like to live that they don't live. A lot of the rainforest plants won't live anywhere else.
Yeah.
So really fragile environments, and these introduced predators are really tearing them up. So I think pest control and widespread but really effective pest control, long-term pest control needs to be a priority. And, as a community, we're just not spending nearly enough money on these issues. It needs a lot more attention.
Yeah. So while we're talking about their ecosystems, could you tell us a bit more about your research into lyrebirds as ecosystem engineers? Because they seem to do the exact opposite of what these invasive species do for the habitats that they're living in.
Yeah, sure. So during my PhD, I was interested in the role of the lyrebirds, not so much their sort of mimicry and their beauty, but more what they're functionally doing in the forest. So when they dig in the soil, lyrebirds have incredibly powerful claws. They're these really big, strong feet. And when you handle a lyrebird and it gets you around the finger with its claws, their claws aren't sharp because they're always scratching and filing them down, but they're incredibly strong. So they'll move big logs and rocks, all searching for invertebrates. And when they're doing this, they're shifting enormous amounts of soil, and they don't shift it that far. They sort of face uphill and then they scratch into the soil and kick it down behind them. So they're moving. I actually measured it during my PhD by putting little buckets in the soil and then fencing off other areas so that I could measure with and without lyrebirds. And I measured the amount of soil they were moving, and it was actually a huge amount. It was 155 tonnes per hectare. So a hectare is 100 by 100 metres, 155 tonnes per year. And they're shifting that soil, and that is actually more than any other organism per unit area on Earth that's been measured to date.
Wow.
So we had a fabulous workshop a few years ago with a lot of people studying ecosystem engineers, and Clive Jones, who's a professor from the US that came up with this notion of ecosystem engineering, he came to this workshop, and shortly after, he was consulted by Guinness World Records, and they were saying, Clive, what's the world record for this? And he said, well, that guy in Australia has shown that these lyrebirds, it's got to be them. So apparently
published?
in the world records.
Wow.
Pardon?
Is it published?
Apparently. Yeah,
Wow.
apparently.
Congratulations.
So that was pretty exciting. So they're very important. So because they move this soil, they're essentially composting. So they dig into the soil, they mix the mineral earth, they bury a lot of the leaf litter and the fine sticks, And that essentially is like a little compost heap. So they're composting. This breaks down fine fuels that would fuel fires. So in sort of mild fire conditions, models have suggested, so some other colleagues at La Trobe Uni some years ago showed that the fire behaviour modelling suggested that having lyrebirds present would actually change the behaviour of fire and make them less severe and less intense. So that's a really important aspect of their foraging, but they're also affecting seedling recruitment, because when they expose the seed bank in the soil, they're letting light in, they're scratching them, they're promoting growth and germination. So they promote many seedlings to grow, but then of course they're also scratching about the same number out. So in terms of the net impact on seedlings, it doesn't change, except that millions more seeds get to germinate and express their phenotype. So if you're a seed that has the genes to grow a really strong and fast growing taproot, you might actually do better. So it's probably still a very important evolutionary process for plants. But then they're also affecting the invertebrates. So when they dig, they're exposing some areas and then they're mixing other areas. And that's all within a matrix of a better defined litter layer. So they'll come back about almost 2 years later when the litter has reformed over the scratching, and they'll redig it. But they won't dig in the same spot until it's sort of got a nice layer formed. So they're actually increasing fine scale habitat niches. So that's like little homes that suit more species. So you end up with more types of invertebrates. And intriguingly enough, we found some evidence to suggest that it might also increase the biomass of those invertebrates in like a farming effect. So that would have a feedback on the lyrebird itself. So essentially, they were really sustainably altering that ecosystem.
Little
Which is what you'd
agriculture
expect.
experts.
Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
they've evolved in these forests for millennia. So, but when you think about Tasmania, where they haven't been, I think they're probably doing a lot of naughty things that they probably shouldn't. So when you look back now, you think, oh, why would you have done that? You know, it's a conservation was, you know, at the heart of the action that they took, but just the wrong outcome. Yeah.
I feel like this is a general theme for our podcast, going back and having a look at choices humans have made in our history and just go, why did you do that?
Yeah.
So
Best of
many
intention
times.
often.
You should change the name of the podcast. Why? Why did you make that choice?
Yeah.
So while we're talking about the benefits that they have for their ecosystem, I'd like to also touch on your work within the bushfire, BirdLife Bushfire Project, because obviously that summer of fires had a huge impact, not just for lyrebirds, but ecosystems and all kinds of wildlife. So if you could tell us a little bit more about what you guys have done in that space and the findings that you came up with.
Yeah, sure. The 2019-20 mega fires, it was our black summer, so it was a really at the end of a really severe drought. And in Eastern Australia, about 12 million hectares of forest are estimated to have burnt. Billions of animals were predicted to have died in that one event. And some early analysis by BirdLife Australia suggested maybe up to 40% of the lyrebird's range was impacted. So they were quite concerned about the species, and out of this concern, there was a partnership formed between WWF and BirdLife and La Trobe, and we undertook a big mapping exercise to understand where the impacts were and how they impacted lyrebird habitat. We only looked at the southern subspecies too, so we went as far north as Bateman's Bay. And not further. So it was sort of a snapshot. It was about as much as we could do in the time we had. But we also did, I did a huge field survey where I visited about 220 sites across that whole range from the inland in, the ACT all the way along the coast as well, and back down to Fish Creek down here in Victoria. And what we found was pretty alarming, to be honest. The temperate rainforests again. So these rainforests are where I've found lyrebirds to be really reliant on for nesting in particular. Female lyrebirds really like the cover, so they really make use of that canopy cover in a rainforest that hides their nests from predators. And there's a lot of moisture in those areas, so there's lots of good foraging. And we found that up to 50% of all the rainforests that lyrebirds inhabit were burnt to some extent, which was really shocking to ecologists, because rainforests aren't like gum trees. They don't have those volatile oils in the leaves. They're generally very wet environments and very stable environments, and very rare to actually see them burn. So to have 50% of the lyrebirds' rainforest lost in one season was just quite a shock to the system, but also to all of the ecologists that were out there studying this event. And then I went out to these sites. So that was sort of our mapping exercise, showed us that rainforests were possibly in a bit of strife. And I did these bird surveys and went to sites that were in rainforest, some that were burnt very lightly, or it might have just been a ground fire. And in general, where there was a ground fire, it wasn't, if it was just a very low intensity fire, there wasn't much difference in the amount of foraging activity compared to the unburnt forest.
Mm-hmm.
But when I went to the severely burnt forests, in the eucalypt forests, there was actually no lyrebird foraging 1 year on after these fires in the canopy consumed class. So that was the highest class of burn, where the leaves were actually incinerated off the trees.
Yep.
And I found not a single site where there was foraging 1 year after. Compared to that, though, that was in the eucalypt forests. When I went into the rainforests, every single rainforest site that I went into had lyrebird foraging, even if it was burnt at the hottest severity level.
Wow.
So this showed to me that these rainforests were really important areas for recovery, and probably even important refuges during the fire, because they would have been wetter when the fire came through.
There's a photo that I seen somewhere. We had some pretty brutal fires near us at Wollombi and Laguna. And there's a photo that a lady took of her dam, where there was a group of male lyrebirds that had come in and was standing in the water at the dam.
Yeah, that's right. So I've actually got that photograph in one of the presentations that I give, and that was an amazing shot that she managed to capture before the fire came through. And all of these lyrebirds mostly seem to be mature males, which was interesting. They must have come from a long way to that dam, so they knew that the dam was there and that was probably a safe place to be. And they get into the water and submerge themselves while the fire comes across. And they manage to survive. They also go down wombat holes, into mine shafts. And often there's been reports of people sheltering in creeks with wet blankets when their houses have caught fire, and lyrebirds have actually pushed in the wet blankets underneath with them to survive the flames, which just seems amazing that it would overcome its fear of humans to survive that fire. But of course, when they come out from those hiding places, where do they hide from predators? Where do they find their food? Where do they nest? And when do they start nesting again? They're all the questions that, are in my mind. And I think it's really tough.
We travelled through like Eden and those areas in September last year, and even in Kosciuszko National Park. And those forests that experience those really intense burns are taking a long time to come back.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know a lot about bushfire, but we have them here around us often, and you will see regeneration fairly quickly, especially if you get some rain afterwards. But like these places were just barren. There was nothing left.
Yeah.
And we're going through, 3 years later.
Yeah, yeah. So it's very variable, and some ecosystems have undoubtedly transitioned. A lot of that happened in certainly the higher altitude forests, where fires have not only been very, very hot and intense, but they've been too frequent over a number of years. And we've got lots of examples now where snow gums in particular have been killed. So a lot of the reproductive strategy of eucalypts is to hold your seeds in the canopy, wait till you get burnt and get killed, and then you release your seeds en masse. Millions of seedlings start to grow. But you have to be old enough to produce those seeds. And if you're burnt twice or 3 times in a small period of time, and you can't attain that age to reproduce your seeds, then you just collapse. And that's what's happened in a lot of alpine ash and snow gum, where I remember on that fieldwork just driving through these areas that were now grassy heaths or grasslands with just dead trees, and I just could not see any eucalypts coming back.
No.
So that's a transition there. That's a complete transition, and that might be locked in that state for decades, and it might require either human management to go in there and do something, reseed or change fire regimes, or we might have to accept that that's now not going to be a snow gum forest or an alpine ash forest. So there's really big decisions that we need to make as a community and society.
You being a scientist may be able to direct us as just normal people who are going out into forests, enjoying our national parks. What are some things that we can do from our end to, obviously putting out fires is one. I have a 10-year-old child who checks every fire pit that we go past to make sure that they've been extinguished. But things that we can do or projects that we can support that will assist in, I suppose, protecting these places and the wildlife that live within them.
Well, quite honestly, I think the biggest thing we can all do is consider who we vote for every time we cast a vote. The major parties in Australia seem to have the same attitude to the environment, and that is a very, very small drip feed of funding that is not sufficient to actually meet the conservation aims, even that we, federally say that we want to do. So it really requires huge amounts of increased funding that and it's not huge amounts of funding as a percentage of our GDP. It's only an incredible landmark sort of research came out the other day that was actually stipulating exactly what we would need to do and spend to turn this ship around for conservation and extinctions, and it's not insurmountable. It's not that much money in the scheme of things. We can do it if we want to. We just lack the political will. So the biggest thing any of us can do is change who we vote for.
Yeah.
Secondly, we can act in our local environment. So that's sort of big picture thing. We can think about our consumption choices. We can think about the sort of cars we drive. We can think about the sort of houses we live in. But then the local things that we can do, there's friends groups and land care groups that do amazing work everywhere. So tomorrow morning, I'll be out with the Friends of Sassafras Creek planting sassafras trees. And we do a monthly working bee. So local land care groups and friends of groups are a really great place to start. If you're a bird watcher, you can log your sightings on bird data, which is a big database that BirdLife Australia manage. And that really helps because, I utilise that that data set for the BirdLife research that I did, which was fantastic because I could look at all the species that were occurring in those sites with the lyrebirds. And that's a powerful way for citizen science to contribute to conservation in a really big way.
We actually used that recently because we spotted a region honeyeater. There was a population released very close to where we live. And Charlie had learned about them at school. They had a national parks member come in and talk about them, and we spotted one. So we were able
Wow.
to log that, which was pretty exciting.
Yeah, so that's a great way of contributing, and that record's there. And a lot of these databases are really good now. There's really they're really searchable, and they're research friendly, and more researchers are using them for various purposes. So it's a great way to contribute to science, for sure. Yep. And then even in your garden, you can just you can really just plant native indigenous plants in your garden, and you'll see birds that weren't there before. If you think about the resources that they might need, like nectar, and think about flowering plants, you'll see your own backyard transform.
Yeah, we can even see it in the difference between our backyard and our front yard with the types of plants that we've got. It'd have to be 100-year-old bottle brush tree in the backyard. And during COVID, it was, we did a bit of a project, and we laid on a blanket and watched what birds were visiting, and we logged those as part of Charlie's schoolwork. But the politics was what got me, of these birds that were there, and the bossy wattle bird, and there was a little, I think it's called an eastern spinebill, which was really, it's a tiny bird, but it was the boss. When it was there, it really gave the wattle bird what for. So watching those birds in the backyard compared to even the front yard, where we have a lot of bushy natives, and it's always full of willy wagtails and little blue wrens. And so just the difference between, it's just a fence, that's the only thing that's between them. But
yeah, they seem to sometimes know, even if it's a walking track or a road, some birds will own that side and the other birds seem to have their territory, and they just seem to split along that natural thing, which I guess it seems sensible.
Yeah, it does.
As somebody who knows nothing, I actually have a few general questions about lyrebirds. Firstly, you've mentioned superb lyrebirds. That's the lyrebird that you've been studying, which is in the lower southeast.
Yep, that's right.
And the difference between superb lyrebirds and other lyrebirds?
Yeah, so there are 2 lyrebirds in Australia, and indeed in the world. There's only 3 known species, including from the fossil record. So extant, still existing today, there is the superb lyrebird, which is the one that's widespread with the beautiful lyre-shaped tail. And they're the one that occurs from Victoria up to Queensland, and the introduced population in Tasmania. But there is also an Albert lyrebird, which lives in the rainforest along the border of New South Wales and Queensland, around that sort of volcanic rim. So they like the subtropical rainforest, and they're a smaller lyrebird. Their body is very russet, sort of chestnut coloured, and they have lyrates, but they're not chestnut like the superb lyrebird. They're these silvery lyrates that curl right around the body, and then they have these big wire feathers or median feathers that they almost look a bit like a bird of paradise in their tail. And they are funny because they don't build a soil mound like the superbs. The Alberts build a platform, and they get this platform out of sticks and vines. And when they do their dance moves and their jumps, they shake all the vines. So all the vines around them are part of the display, and they jump up and down and clap these things together. And it's a little bit like a corroboree. And you might think, actually, that might have been what the Indigenous folk up there were basing some of their songs and dances on, no doubt. But they're a beautiful bird too.
Yeah, cool. The other question I had was, do you know, as somebody who does not share the knowledge of you two right now, how do I know when I go somewhere? Now I know where, sure, the location of where I would have to be, but how do I know it's not a kookaburra or an eagle?
Yeah, that's a good question. So because they are so perfect with their mimicry, I think if you played me just a snapshot call, I certainly couldn't tell the difference if it was a lyrebird or a grey shrike thrush. However, when you hear them in real life, they have a string of calls. They rapidly transition from a crimson rosella to a kookaburra to a grey shrike thrush to a magpie to a currawong. and it's all coming from the same spot in the forest, and it's generally often closer to the ground than you'd expect for all of these bird calls. So that's the first clue. But the other thing that Shannon mentioned was the kookaburra being truncated. And they do seem to shorten almost every call. So they're very, very accurate for the notes that they do produce, but they're often missing a few of the repetitive natured notes of the real thing. So they get as much information in as quickly as they can. So I guess they've only got the attention of the girls for a very short time, so they have to impress.
That's very cool. I just want to say that it's been fascinating to watch somebody who is equal on the passion scale as Shannon. So absolutely amazing learning from you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex, for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
It has been an absolute joy listening to you speak and sharing that incredible information in regards to my own personal obsession. So thanks for joining us.
My
Thank you.
pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank
Alex.
you. All righty, appreciate it.
Thank
See
you.
you soon.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Oh my God, he's the best.
The minute that I come across his presentation on YouTube, I was just so sucked in, and even just our little messages to through Instagram and stuff when I was talking to him about if he'd be possibly interested in coming on the pod. He's just such a beautiful, lovely, genuine guy. What a pleasure. If you are interested in some of the stuff that Alex has talked about today, we'll have some links in the show notes so you can check out some of the work that he's been doing with the BirdLife Bushfire Project, and a link to the YouTube presentation in regards to his research.
I'm really interested in the David Attenborough video too. Is that something that we can get a link to?
Yes, we can absolutely put a link into that as well. So we'll have all of that information in the show notes so you can check out some of the work that Alex has been doing and the things that we've talked about today. Again, thanks to Dr. Alex Maisey for joining us today, and thanks to all of you guys for being here and learning about lyrebirds alongside of us.
Catch you next time. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of If These Trees Could Talk. If you would like to access more about the places or information included in today's topic, please visit our website ifthesetreescouldtalk.com.au. If you would like to follow us on our adventures, check us out on Facebook or Insta. Our creative writer is Shannon Walters, and our podcast is produced at Bellevue Studio in the Hunter Valley with audio production by Megan Anderson. We love to hear your feedback, so please rate and review, and if you would like to hear more, please subscribe. We look forward to you joining us for our next adventure.